But then there's one more element. It's a social and a cultural system as well. Relentless innovation. This is one of the reasons, again, that many people are frightened of capitalism, and Marx also brings this up. All that is solid melts into air. Constant change, innovation, such that you can't predict what the future is going to bring about. Free market capitalism means, in a way, being open to the future, understanding it is not subject to our conscious control. The Marxian conception, the socialist conceptions of freedom, is very different from the liberal, and we understand classical liberal understanding of freedom. For Marx and others of this orientation, to be free is to be fully conscious, meaning you plan your own future. Everything that happens in future is the outcome of a deliberate design of the human mind. That's what freedom is. And it's inherently a collective understanding of freedom, not individual freedom, but that the collectivity, as he says in the essay on the Jewish question, man is a species being, whereas liberalism, by right, divides us, in his view, into individuals. He thought the true essence of man was to be a collective. That was the essence of the human being, and to be free was for us collectively to determine our future. This is a fantasy, a catastrophe, and every time people have tried to implement it, it's generated human suffering on unimaginable scale. Because in fact, we cannot predict the future. There's always novelty, learning, and surprise. And free market capitalism means being open to being surprised, new products, new lifestyles, new ways of doing things. You have a highly dynamic, innovative society, but rests on a well-defined, legally secure, and predictable legal order. That seems paradoxical to some people. That the fundamental ground rules are stable, but the outcome generates a highly dynamic, highly ever-changing social system. It rests on, among those, the idea of careers open to talent. This is a great innovation in human history. That your future course of life is subject to your own choice, your ability to take a gamble, take a risk, to try something, and not being told, no, you're in the leather workers case, or the case that deals with carrying night soil, or you're a serf and you're tied to the land, or you're an aristocrat, or a king, or a prince, or you're born into a priestly family, that your future is determined by your birth. Free market capitalism rested on the idea of the liberation of the human person, to forge your own future. The elimination of all titles of nobility, at least in terms of legal significance. Tom Paine, who was an early theorist of this, mocked nobility. As he said, nobility is just a short way of saying no ability. These are people who had power and privilege without having done anything. They were just born to it, no accomplishment. This innovation, though, is decentralized. There's no ministry of innovation. The very concept is rather horrifying. It's happening all around us. It happens in garages. It's when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak are puttering around with electronics, or various people figuring out ways to do things. Now, obviously, the electronics and computer industry comes to mind, but that's not the only one. I'll give a simple example. A friend of mine who's a quite wealthy person now, he started out working on the shop floor in a factory, mixing paint in a paint factory. And after a time, he figured out, we've got 7 extra steps in mixing the paint to guarantee the right color. 7 more steps than we need. And he figured out how to engineer a machine that would eliminate those 7 extra steps and extra personnel needed to do that, save costs. He made one. He hired an engineer to make the blueprints and started manufacturing them. So that was innovation on the shop floor, by just someone who's paying attention to how things are being done. Now he manufactures these at various factories around the world. Now, to find out which innovations are successful, you need a process of trial and error. Most innovations are not good ideas. So we experience every 4 years in the United States, people say, where are the new ideas? These are old ideas. I think it's such a silly thought. Most new ideas are stupid, right? Just like most genetic mutations are not helpful to an organism. I like some old ideas that work, like arithmetic. I use arithmetic every day. It is always the same. and it's reliable. I like it. I don't want a new arithmetic where 1 and 1 is 11, for instance. I like it where it's 2. It's quite predictable. But some innovations are advances. How to distinguish the good ones from the bad ones. We have a trial and error process and a way of winnowing them out called profit and loss in the market economy. You make profits, it means you took something that had an opportunity cost of, let's say, $100, and you were able to combine those and sell them for $107. You added $7 of value, at least. That is a profit. But if you combined them and could sell them for $91, you destroyed $9 of value. That's a very powerful signal that says, stop doing that. For one thing, you will run out of money if you keep on doing it. You won't be able to do it anymore. So we have processes in the market economy for identifying useful innovations and those that are not useful. Now, capitalism has a very robust moral foundation. Some of my more collectivist friends, when I told them I was preparing a book on the morality of capitalism, they snickered and said, oh, does capitalism even have a morality? The answer is yes, it does. It has a very robust moral foundation. And the first point is every human being is important. Every single human life matters. No one is put here to be used by another person. As a slave, as some kind of object, as property. Each one of you is unique. There will never be a person like you again, exactly like you. And you have the right to lead your own life, and to make the choices that will govern your life. It rests on a very radical idea. It's a little extreme. So I'm going to put it up here. Don't be too shocked. Other people don't belong to us. I may have great plans for your life, but it is your life. You do not belong to me. You get to make decisions about your life. This is very difficult for many people to grasp, who think other people should recognize how brilliant I am, what a genius I am, and should submit to me. But the belief in liberty and free market capitalism denies that. Other people are not here for us to control. And therefore, respect for property. Property is a very important term in English. It has shrunk in meaning. Today, we talk about this watch, we say, this is my property. Earlier generations would not have said that. That's a very clumsy language. They would have said, I have a property in this watch. To wear it, to enjoy it, to sell it, to rent it, do all kinds of things with it, to dispose of it. I have a property in it. But fundamentally, it's because I have a property in my own person. This is the language John Locke uses, and various Spanish scholastics and others. I don't belong to anybody else. I have a property in my own person to exclude other people from the enjoyment of my body or the disposal of my life. I have a property in my freedom, to be able to determine how I want to live. There's a presumption of liberty. We do not insist that you justify everything you want to do, that you have to justify your freedom. The burden of proof is on the person who will limit your freedom to show why that is an acceptable point, an acceptable practice. Just as the burden of proof in a criminal trial is not on the accused to prove that he or she is innocent, but on the accuser to prove that he or she is guilty and therefore should be deprived of freedom. It's quite similar. And then property in your estate. What we call today property, this is my property in modern English, in earlier generations would have been called my estate. And I have a property in my estate, my watch, my clothes, my house, my car, and so on. And to function efficiently, that property and estate has to be characterized by three principles, 3 Ds. Must be definable, so I can know what is yours and what is mine. And typically, when you travel to very poor countries and investigate the legal system, the first thing you find is lack of clarity in property rights. The state has failed to allow people to know what is theirs and what is their neighbor's. And people invest a great deal of resources fighting as a consequence, as any one of us would as well. If you don't know where your property begins and the other property ends, people won't spend a lot of time fighting over it. It has to be defendable. Now, defendable takes many forms, and immediately we think of government, but we should have a wider understanding of how property claims are defended. Take the case of someone would want to take my suit from me, for example, or my beloved Macintosh MacBook Pro. I wouldn't call the police. This is not a useful exercise. They would first meet my personal defense association, which is my FIST. Very effective system. No one has ever tried to take my MacBook Pro from me because they know that they will run into this first of all. We also invest in other ways in protecting our property or in our estate. Locks. We lock our doors. We invest a lot of money in locking devices. Your house, the ignition key in your car, you have the key that goes into that car. Why? Because there are thieves. We know that. And so we defend our property in this fashion by investing quite substantial sums of money in locked ignition devices. Now, there are some places they don't do that. You go to Minnesota, it's really, really cold in the winter. People will leave their car running as they go out to do shopping, because if you come out, it'll die. I don't know if this happens much here, but in small towns in Minnesota, people don't steal other people's cars. I wouldn't do that in New Jersey, lots of other places. In Switzerland, I once was in a village where people had scooters, motorbikes, with no ignition keys, just an on and off button. They were cheaper, and that told me something. There are no thieves here. Or maybe there were at one point, and something bad happened to them. But finally, for more complex forms of property, like shares in a company, or the right to a flow of resources to be paid back, a loan or a mortgage, your fist isn't very effective. You can't put a lock on it. There's no key. And for that, we need a legal system and various ways of adjudicating disputes that can issue legal documents you can take to your bank that will then attach the assets or secure your property claims. So for that, we do need a governmental legal system. And finally, they should be divestible, that is to say transferable. This is an old-fashioned English word. It just means transferable. But we can't have that because then we have DDT, which is bad. So we use D instead. Divestible means you can transfer it to another person through gift or sale at relatively low cost. This is another case where we find systematic state failure around the world. Legal systems that are so complex, so corrupt, that undertaking a sale of a piece of property can take literally years. And that means that potential gains from trade are not realized by the various parties. So, as corollaries, equality before the law, the presumption of liberty, including freedom of contract. It is presumed you can make any contract you want unless there is a good reason for you not to be allowed to do that, and the rule of law. Now, some people argue, well, we have to choose between property rights and human rights, as if people who believe in property rights think property has rights, which would be a kind of puzzling perspective. Property rights are human rights. As John Locke put it, he refers to, again, lives, liberties, and estates, which I call by the general name property. So sometimes when you read rather facile intellectual historians, they'll say Locke and others, all they cared about was the rights of property, as though all that mattered was land or tangible goods of some kind, economic assets. But Locke is very explicit repeatedly, as were others, life, liberty, and estate, which is understood under the general name of property. Property comes from that which is proper to you, means your property. Now, free market capitalism is a lot more than just well-defined, legally secure, and transferable property rights. It also entails a cultural attitude, a commitment, if you will, to entrepreneurship, to innovation, service, and adding value. The purpose of economic behavior is not just to be busy. It's to add value to the world.